town hall meeting, and we start every one of them just like we did back in middle school. We'd like everybody to stand when we read hats and we'll say the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. My name is Troy Cormier. I'm one of the executive board members for Flyway Federation. So I always get the question is, what is Flyway? There's a lot of misnomers, what we are, what we're about, that kind of thing. We are a 501c nonprofit organization. Same type of classification as some of the other organizations that are involved in the hunting industry, those kinds of things. So what makes us different, or what are we about? Well, there's a couple of things. One, we are a conservation group, but we're a conservation group based off from the eyes of the hunter. We want to continue the traditions and the history of hunting. We'll pass that down to generations upon generations. And we fully believe that you cannot be a hunter and not be a conservationist. They go hand in hand. However, you can be a conservationist and not a hunter. And I think if you think about that, that y'all fully understand that point. And throughout this presentation tonight, you'll see possibly some differences between a hunter that's a conservationist viewpoint versus just a conservationist, okay? So we don't want to tell you what to think. Nowadays, the media and everybody else tells you, you need to think this, you need to think that. So with no further ado, this is Mr. Ryan Doucette. We're going to go ahead and he's going to start the presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Troy. I would like to personally thank y'all for all coming out. I'm a duck hunter. I'm in my mid-50s. I come from the commercial side. For the last 30 years, I've hunted 50 days or more a year, majority of them in Cameron Parish. I've been very fortunate personally to be a part of some really good properties, and I've always appreciated that and don't take it for granted. There's a lot of information we're fixing to show you here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to condense it down to where I can understand it, and I hope that you can understand it. It's very technical, a lot of it, so we have binders that if you care to look at it to see where some of the information is. We also have the website they talked about. Well, but that being said, the first thing we need to talk about, is there a problem with the duck hunting? Well, the first way you figure out if we can fix a problem is we got to find out if there's a problem. We're going to talk about 1976. The reason we're going to pick 76, we had to start somewhere. In my lifetime, 76 is what started the heyday of Louisiana duck hunting. This is what we started with the 55 plus days a year, 50, 55, 60 days a year, where we were able to harvest under the point system 10 birds equal 100 points. Okay, we're going to deal with the flight, the fall flight first, because really that's what matters. How many we harvest, if we only get 1 million ducks here and we kill 900,000 of them, that's not really a win. We need to see about how many ducks are actually being bred in the north and how many of them are making it to Louisiana. Okay, 1976, they had 33.5 million ducks. Okay, we're going to jump 20 years. We're going to try to go in 20-year increments. Okay, 1996, that was the start of when we had 5 ducks, 50 days, that was the start of the ducks coming back. We had 39.1 million ducks at that time, almost 17% increase. Okay, we're going to jump 20 more years. 2016, there's 48.4 million ducks. Fall flight that year. That's a little less than a 50% increase over 1976. I know a lot of guys in here were too young to remember that, but those of us that did remember it, this will really hit home with them. Okay, now let's talk about 2017. This was, if you remember, this was one of the coldest winters in 20 years. 2017, it snowed. I live on the Gulf, a mile from the Gulf, and it snowed twice that year at my home. So this was a very, very, very cold year. Okay, now go to 2018, which was last year. 41.2 million ducks. That's 23% more than we had in 1976. These numbers are kind of important. I want y'all just kind of look at it You see, we started out with a decent number of ducks. It went up. It fell some, but it's still way ahead of what it was in 1976. Okay. Now, this is the same numbers we were talking about a while ago. We're going to go a little more in detail with it. Breeding population, 33.5 million. 5.5 million of them were here in Louisiana. Okay? The harvest was a little more than 1.7 million that year. Okay? We had a little less than 123,000 hunters in Louisiana. Okay? Now, let's jump 20 years again. 1996, breeding population, as you saw a while ago, 39 million, right at it. The survey, 5.2 million were using Louisiana. Our harvest was 1.8, pretty good harvest. Well, we killed 1.8 with only 96,000 hunters that year. So, all this is really fixing to come into play on this next slide. Okay, this is 2016. Breeding population, 48 million ducks. Only 2.4 of them were here in Louisiana. Do you realize that the duck numbers went up 15 million ducks, and we lost half our ducks in Louisiana in 2016. These aren't our numbers. These are that come off the Mississippi Flyway data book. These are the official numbers turned in for the Mississippi Council. Okay. We did that. We harvested 830,000 ducks, quite a bit under a million. We did it with 64,000 hunters. I keep hearing that pressure. We're putting all this pressure. In 76, we had 122,000 hunters. In 2016, we got half that many. I've been saying this, that the area where I hunt in, there's larger areas for the ducks to rest in my area than where it's ever been. I'm not saying that's that way across the state. I'm just telling you, in Cameron Parish, where I hunt, that's the way it is, and the numbers back it up. It shows you that we've lost half our hunters. Okay, now, going to bring us to last year. It's the worst waterfowl season in Louisiana history. Okay, we only had 1.9 million ducks in Louisiana last year. They said that we harvested right at 500,000. Okay? Do you realize since 2014, we lost 63% of our ducks in Louisiana? 63%. And there is a plus minus. They have to allow for variables to be off. Their variable here is 32%. They can be off one way or the other, up to 32% on this particular harvest count. If they add 32% to that 500,000 ducks, it's still the worst year in Louisiana history. But you take 32% off of there, I don't know why we woke up and went to the marsh anymore. I mean, these, remember guys, these are their numbers. These are not ours. Okay? And the snow geese, let's talk about the white fronts and the snow geese. All right, white fronts, they're showing in 2017, 2018, we killed a little over 16,000 specks in the state. That's 70% loss in 1 year. Snow geese, problem with this is we didn't include the blue geese in it. They broke it down separately. They said nobody killed Ross's goose in Louisiana in 2018-19. I don't know if I can believe that. But anyway, they're showing that we lost 75% of our light geese in 1 year. And this is not just a Louisiana issue. The year previous, the Wildlife and Fisheries in Texas put an article in the Houston Chronicle saying they had lost since 2000, they had lost 68% of their ducks statewide and 90% of their geese. Well, now that we've started really doing some research, their numbers mirror our numbers, almost identical. So, going to bring us to this, okay? Gray ducks. We're going to use gray ducks because I love them. And I think they're killed in the majority of Louisiana. This is the 2017 season. The highest population of gray ducks ever recorded, 2017, 141% above the long-term average. We touched on a while ago that 2017 was the coldest winter in about 20 years. All right, I want you to look at this top band recovery. See where this was a 99-2000 season. Can y'all see where the band recoveries were? Now you look at 2017, 2018. You see where there's no band recoveries? They didn't just stop banding gray ducks. The ducks are not, this is a pretty good barometer of what we're killing. So, if the coldest winter in 20 years, we didn't get gray ducks down here, and a gray duck is supposed to be a photo period migrator. They're not supposed to be dependent on the weather. It's supposed to be when the nights get longer, days get shorter. They're like the blue-winged teal. It starts your migration instinct. Well, what happened? This is 20 years apart. Look at the difference. Okay? And again, you can check. These are not our numbers. These are all this information we're giving you comes from Wildlife and Fisheries, the biologists throughout all the organizations in the country. This is all input and this is all common knowledge. Okay. Now, we're going to show you a bunch of information in a little while. It's going to be like going back to geography, some geometry, science, everything at once. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to make it where I can understand it, and I ain't too short. We're going to pick one state to compare with. We picked Missouri because that's the state we picked. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk in a little bit about, we're going to use, as we use those years, 76, 96, 16, we're going to use Missouri and Louisiana as a comparison. Because we can't do all the states, it just takes up too much time. Okay, this to me shows a problem. Missouri season dates in 1976, they opened in October, the last weekend in October. They closed the 3rd of January. All right? In 1996, they opened 3rd week of October. They closed the 2nd week of January. Still really close to the same time. Now, look at 2018. They opened up November 3rd, which is the first Saturday in November. They closed the 27th of January. Did you notice that we closed the 26th of January? If I lived in Missouri, or any of us lived in Missouri, if we thought that ice was going to drive our ducks out of our state, we wouldn't want the season to go when you're in Missouri the last 2 weeks of January, you have a very high percentage of chance that it's going to be frozen over. Especially in 2017 when we had that record cold. Well, this is right after we had that record cold. You know what? They didn't ask them to back the seasons up anymore, move them forward. They're still happy with them ending when there shouldn't be a duck in that state. And you look, Louisiana, 76, 96, 18, regardless of the number of days, they still started the 2nd week of November. They still closed about the 20th, the 26th of January. Okay, this is important because you can see that Missouri's backing these days up, so are all the other states around them. And if you're not going to, you tell me one hunter that's going to allow the season to be backed up if they don't have a chance of killing ducks. We don't want to kill ducks. We don't want to hunt in August because there's no ducks there. So, all right, we've got a PowerPoint presentation, and I want to introduce Dr. Mark Merchant. He holds a PhD in biochemistry and biophysics. He's a professor at McNeese State University. He's from Texas. He came to us. He looked at Josh's data. He did an independent audit of the facts, and these are his findings. Mark, can you come up?
So my name's Mark Merchant. Thank you guys for coming out today. It's good to see a full room. I'm like all of you in this room. Everybody's got a story when they started hunting. Most of those stories start with a hand like this. I made my first duck hunt when I was 6 years old with my grandfather. been hooked ever since. As far as I'm concerned, you can have the squirrels. Nothing wrong with those. You can have those deer. I'm a waterfowl hunter. I kill ducks and I kill geese, and I love it. Have for, I don't know, 40-something years. The thing that sets me apart from you is you guys live in Louisiana and I live in Texas. That's about it. But I have a pretty close association with Louisiana because although I live in Texas, I've been employed as a professor at McNeese State University over in Lake Charles for the last 19 years. And I spend an appreciable amount of time in my professional life. I do a lot of duck hunting. Starting weekend from next, I'll be in the rice field in down south Louisiana, 16 days in a row. And I don't miss a day. I'll bring my lab with me. He goes and I have a Kindle in my laboratory, and he sleeps in that Kindle during the day when I'm in class. So we have a lot in common. And just like you guys, a lot of you guys, we've been at it a long time, and I've been wondering what's happening to our duck populations in the South. I've seen it, you've seen it, no doubt. That's why we're here. But I have some tools in my arsenal. I'm a scientist, and I love to analyze data. And go back 20 years, I had heard about what was happening up north, and I was aware, probably earlier than most people, about what was going on and with changes of laws and changes of agricultural practices that we talked about. But I found it hard to believe that that was what was responsible for what we're seeing today, or whatever all you guys are seeing today. I didn't believe it, found it hard to believe. And so I launched my own investigation. I'm a data guy. I know where to find data online. I know how to analyze data. And so what you're about to see is my compilation of data, stuff I found online, stuff I found at the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries website, stuff I found on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, weather data from the National Weather Service, weather data from NOAA. This is my data, like you know, I think like Troy said, this is stuff I found online, and I can gladly give you those websites if you want to go look at it. I want you to watch this video, and I'd like to know what you think. This is my take on what's happening. This is, and I want to make it another point. When I launched this independent investigation, my attitude wasn't, oh, they're baiting up north and I'm going to go out and prove it. My attitude, what's going on? Because I didn't believe this. And I was shocked at what I found. And I think you might be too. So.
I'd like to start with a discussion of the history of the migration of Canada geese to Louisiana. In 1945, there were estimated to be approximately 200,000 Canada geese that wintered annually in Louisiana, primarily in the southern coastal zone. However, just 10 years later, in 1955, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries aerial survey showed a count of less than 2,000 Canada geese, for a 99% reduction. During this time, the population of Canada geese in the Mississippi Flyway, along with nesting success, underwent a population explosion. So, while the population was expanding rapidly, Louisiana experienced an exponential decrease in the migration of this species. Where did the Canada geese go, and why? In the late 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service started and propagated a waterfowl feeding program targeting Canada geese on Horseshoe Lake, Swan Lake, and Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge in Illinois, and the numbers of wintering geese in this area exploded. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of corn were piled by dump trucks on levees, where the corn was literally 2 feet deep in places. This was the beginning of the end of the migration of Canada geese to Louisiana, as aerial surveys recorded a plunge in the movement of geese to the southern reaches of their previous migratory route. And the midwinter surveys in Louisiana recorded numbers of less than 1% of the once numerous migration, despite a population explosion during the past 50 years. This short stoppage of Canada geese has been well documented, and a migration that once looked like this, with hundreds of thousands of geese wintering on the coastal plains and associated rice fields in Louisiana, now looks like this, with the vast majority of wintering geese in the Midwest and Ohio Valley. At this time, while the Canada goose migration to Louisiana became decimated, the midwinter surveys of these same birds in Missouri skyrocketed, followed later by populations in Iowa, Ohio, and Michigan, as these feeding programs were implemented in those states. I would like to now turn our attention to duck migration. There are certainly an abundance of factors that can affect waterfowl migration, including weather influences such as temperature and rainfall, and also the availability of food. The southern portions of the Central and Mississippi flyways have experienced a great reduction in waterfowl migration during the past 20 to 25 years. Many have claimed that this alteration of migration is due to warming weather patterns. To investigate this possibility, I plotted the average winter temperature in Louisiana during the waterfowl season from 1994 to 2018 against the Louisiana mallard migration. This plot shows that the migration does not correlate with annual temperature. However, waterfowl migration does not necessarily correlate with temperatures on the Gulf Coast, and thus it might be better to look, with respect to weather, further north. Therefore, I examined this correlation with the temperature in St. Louis, Missouri and Chicago, Illinois, and the same lack of correlation was observed. But perhaps average winter temperatures are not the best indicators of migration either. So we investigated the correlation of snowfall with migration. This graph represents the autumn snowfall across the Midwestern United States from 1967 to 2018. This chart shows that the snowfall actually increases over the past 52 years and shows an even more dramatic increase during the past 20 years when migration has shown a steep decline. The same lack of correlation was observed with winter snowfall, as there is an increase in snowfall which should stimulate an increase in migration. Thus, it does not appear that snowfall has a positive impact on duck migration. To be exhaustive in our research, we went one step further to investigate the role of rainfall in the loss of duck migration to the lower portions of the flyways. The following graphs show the annual rainfall in St. Louis, Missouri, Bismarck, North Dakota, Chicago, Illinois, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Lake Charles, Louisiana from 1994 to 2018. It is very clear that the rainfall in the Midwest and the upper portions of the northern prairies, or even the lower portions of the flyways, does not correlate with migration, particularly during the past 20 years when the loss of migration has been the greatest. If the loss of migration does not correlate with weather, low temperatures, rainfall, or snowfall in the northern areas of the flyways, then what is the reason for these changes? In 1998, Congress again amended the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That same year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also introduced proposed regulatory changes to liberalize U.S. baiting laws. These regulatory changes became law in 1999, thereby legalizing the baiting of waterfowl. Since this time, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service baiting regulations have allowed hunters to plant, grow, and flood agricultural commodity crops for the sole purpose and with the sole intent of attracting, concentrating, and holding large numbers of migrating waterfowl. This graph clearly shows that after the liberalization of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service changes to baiting regulations in 1998 and 1999 that allowed hunters to plant, levee, and flood corn for the express purpose of attracting and hunting waterfowl, the number of mallards migrating to Louisiana plummeted. Before this time, there was a lot of variability in the migration, which was no doubt due to inconsistent successes of yearly hatch rates and wavering annual weather patterns. But after the 1998 and 1999 regulatory changes, none of those factors seemed to impact mallard migration, as it rapidly declined over the next 20 years, despite increased snowfall, decreased average winter temperatures, and increased populations. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service annual band encounters with mallards in Louisiana show the exact same story, with banding frequency increasing until 1998, and then a steep decline after the 1998 legalization of hunting over flooded crops. I've spoken a lot about mallards because they are a flagship species and also the species of duck most affected by these abnormal agricultural practices. I would like to now redirect our focus to examine the effects of flooded grains on other duck species. The pattern of gadwall migration is a little different from that of mallards, in that the annual migration of gadwall from 1955 to 1998 showed a healthy increase, but then a sharp decline after 1998. This decline in gadwall occurred at a time when there was a strong increase in breeding populations, and thus the sharp reduction of the gadwall migration to the lower stretches of the Central and Mississippi flyways was not due to poor breeding success or declines in population. Furthermore, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service annual band encounters with gadwall in Louisiana mirrored those Louisiana Department of Fish and Wildlife midwinter aerial surveys, with increases in Louisiana banding until 1998 and then a sharp decline after. In addition, the same patterns were observed for widgeon, when a decline in migration after 1998 occurred at the same time that the population of this species was increased dramatically. And once again, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band encounters with widgeon in Louisiana reflected the same sharp decline after the 1998 and 1999 legislative changes. If the problem with duck migration really is due to the widespread problem of baiting waterfowl with flooded grains in the Midwest, then the migration of duck species that are not heavily dependent on grain should not be affected. To determine if this was the case, we investigated the migration of diving ducks after 1998. These graphs show that the migration of ringnecks, scaup, redheads, and canvasbacks, the four primary species of diving ducks in Louisiana, actually increased after 1998. Furthermore, if weather was a factor in the loss of dabbling duck migration, then the migration of these diving duck species should be equally affected. All of these data provide strong evidence that the liberalized baiting regulations that were proposed and adopted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1998 and 1999 have had a drastic effect on the migration of dabbling ducks to the lower reaches of the Central and Mississippi flyways. Although we have used migration to Louisiana as a model in this presentation, we have also collected similar data for migration of waterfowl to Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama. Today, the migration of North American waterfowl faces the threat of massive short stopping, and we have provided irrefutable evidence that this growing problem has been exacerbated every year during the past few decades. For those who say that the practice of producing flooded grain does not and cannot affect migratory waterfowl, I say look to the practices of baiting the Canada geese for refuge in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, because those practices completely ended the migration of that entire population of Canada geese, and we are likely to never see those geese in Louisiana again. We are currently observing the same patterns of waterfowl stoppage with ducks. Before closing, I would like to present two documents pertaining to the 1998 Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the North American Wetland Conservation Act. The first is a clause from the MBTA itself. Section 4 mandates that the Secretary submit a report to Congress analyzing the effects of this legislation and the general practice of baiting on migratory bird conservation and law enforcement efforts. The second is a clause from the North American Wetland Conservation Act. On page 10, Section 10 mandates that the Secretary file a report concerning the results and implementation of this act, and to communicate an assessment of the number of acres enhanced, the trends in population sizes and distributions of North American migratory birds. Based on the evidence just presented concerning the effects that this legislation has had on the migration of dabbling duck species, it is clear that these reports were either one, not submitted by the Secretary to Congress, or two, the drastic effects that the manipulation of this legislation has had on waterfowl migration has been largely ignored.
And so I'm welcome to throw anything. If anybody's got other factors, I'd like to do more research. I can go right back to the computer and I can add to this presentation. I'd like to end what I had to say with a couple anecdotal things. I'm not sure how many of you guys were hunting back in the late 70s and through the mid 80s, but I can remember being, I was pretty young then, but I can remember being out in an airboat, in a flat, brushing blinds in mid-October, getting ready, because In Texas, we usually start one weekend before you. We start first weekend in November. So we're brushing blinds a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks before, getting ready. And I can remember it's 90 degrees. You're out there shirtless, swatting mosquitoes, gators everywhere, snakes still. It's hot. It's 90 degrees. And being in a marsh that's absolutely chock-a-block full of birds. I mean, gadwall, widgeon, pintail, everywhere, everywhere. And this wasn't one year, this was every year. And you just couldn't wait because we knew what would come November 5th or 4th, we were going to literally murder those birds. And it was like that every year. You remember it.
I've seen it.
Have you seen it lately?
No. I was on the first week of the squirrel season. It was always over on the first side of the month. And the way we go to the squirrel farm, we had to pass the lake. And that they chocolate block with any duck anymore.
And I can remember them landing in the flat, and we're out there in a boat, you know, just standing around, brushing lines. And we know that the diurnal cycle, the DL cycle, the shortening of days stimulates migration. Well, it used to. It doesn't anymore. We just don't see that early migration. We don't see that early, and I haven't seen it in quite some time. But I also can remember when I was younger, much younger, I can remember being in rice fields and in marshes during that last week in September, hunting teal, and seeing that marsh inundated with pintail. And now, you know, I see pintail every year. I'll see pintail in lake, but not like I used to, man. I see not a flock of 15, a flock of, I mean hundreds and hundreds of coming in late September. I haven't seen that in 20 years, not any. So, you know, there's things have changed. Birds don't migrate based on the length of days, based on that winter time coming. And that used to, and you go back and look at the literature, and the scientific literature of duck migration says that is the biggest driver of duck migration. Well, that's all changed, because obviously it's not anymore. Days are still getting shorter like they used to, so something's changed. The other thing is how many guides do we have in here? That's a little bit different. Usually we have a lot of guides. Okay. Back when I was young, I haven't guided in years, but I was a guide when I was 18, 20, 24 years old. And back in those days, everybody I guided was from up north. Everybody came down to where we were because that's where the birds ended up. And now, we guide people from around here. Back when I was a kid, you were insane if you would pay for a hunt. I said, why would I pay for a hunt? I got all the birds I want. Now I'm in public land sometimes. Now what do? And I'm as guilty as sin as ever. I go up north and hunt. Hell, I go to Kansas every year. I go to Oklahoma. That's where the birds are. They're not down here like they used to be. But the weather patterns are even more favorable for them to be down here. So ask yourself, what's changed? I don't know. For me, it's clear, but I don't want to. You saw the data, so I ask you to just, if you got anything else you'd like to throw in there, and have me analyze another factor, I'll do it. Anyway, yes, sir.
When you were reading in there about the Congress having to get a report about the effects of the law, well, have those reports been filed?
I'm going to let Josh address that. Apparently, they were filed, but they didn't. What was Josh saying? They didn't give the impact on migration. They left that part out.
They just said that the ducks they did a real in-depth study, reporting system about where the ducks were hatched, where the wintering areas, staging areas. When it got to the wintering areas, all they said was traditional areas, nothing more. Didn't give the numbers. Everything else was broke down in very specific numbers until it got to the wintering area.
Very, very generic, sort of nebulous report with no detail.
The only answer was, it went from pages for everything else to a paragraph, basically saying the ducks were forested in traditional wintering areas. So they technically turned the reports in. But what they didn't address the problem. Didn't address what we're all seeing.
And Congressman Abraham is looking into that for us.
Yeah, that started when